Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt and the woman who defied an empire. A woman beyond her legend. She has been called a seductress, a sorceress, a political manipulator, and a goddess. For more than 2 millennia, Cleopatra VII Philopator has remained one of the most captivating figures in world history, not just because of the men she loved, but because of the kingdom she ruled, the enemies she faced, and the power she wielded in an age when women rarely held it. Born into a dynasty soaked in intrigue and violence, Cleopatra's story is not merely one of romance and tragedy, it's a tale of intelligence, strategy, and survival. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a queen who stood at the crossroads of 2 civilizations, Greece and Egypt, and who dared to defy the mighty Roman Empire. Cleopatra's legend has endured because she was more than her beauty. She was a linguist, a scholar, a diplomat, and a warrior queen. She ruled Egypt not as a figurehead, but as a sovereign in her own right, navigating deadly political waters with brilliance and resolve. Her life was a drama of Shakespearean proportions, with all the ambition, betrayal, love, and sorrow of the greatest tragedies. But who was Cleopatra really, beyond the myths and marble busts? To understand her, we must first understand the world she was born into. The world Cleopatra was born into. Cleopatra entered the world in 69 BCE, during the final centuries of ancient Egyptian civilization. But this wasn't the era of the pyramid builders or the great Ramses kings. Cleopatra's Egypt was ruled by a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had controlled the country ever since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I Soter, took over Egypt following Alexander's death in 323 BCE. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks by origin, and for nearly 3 centuries, they had governed Egypt as foreign monarchs, often out of touch with their Egyptian subjects. They spoke Greek, dressed like Hellenistic rulers, and even married their own siblings to preserve their bloodline, in keeping with both Greek and Pharaonic traditions. But by the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic dynasty was crumbling from within. Infighting, assassinations, corruption, and civil war plagued the royal family. The once great empire was a shadow of itself, wealthy, yes, but unstable and vulnerable to foreign manipulation, particularly from Rome, which was growing stronger by the day. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was known as a weak ruler. He heavily depended on Rome to keep his throne and was hated by many of his own people. He even had to flee Egypt at one point and bribe Roman senators to regain his crown. Cleopatra grew up in this environment of political chaos and cultural collision, watching as Rome's shadow loomed larger over Egyptian affairs. But she also learned from it. Unlike many of her royal ancestors, Cleopatra made a conscious effort to understand her people. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in generations to speak fluent Egyptian, in addition to Greek and several other languages. This wasn't just a linguistic feat, it was a political statement. Cleopatra saw herself not just as a Greek queen in Egypt, but as an Egyptian ruler. She aligned herself with the goddess Isis, who represented motherhood, magic, and fertility, and presented herself as the living embodiment of the deity. Even as a teenager, Cleopatra showed signs of the strategic mind that would one day command armies and court the greatest powers of the age. But she was about to be thrown into the storm far earlier than anyone could have predicted. The rise of a queen, power, politics, and exile. When Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BCE, the throne passed to his daughter and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. As was custom in the Ptolemaic dynasty, the two were meant to rule jointly, and even marry, as was typical of royal siblings at the time. Cleopatra was just 18 years old, and Ptolemy XIII only around 10. But the co-rule quickly unraveled into a power struggle. Cleopatra had no intention of being a puppet queen. She dropped her brother's name from official documents and placed her own image on coins, signaling her desire to rule alone. This assertiveness did not sit well with the powerful courtiers surrounding her young brother. A civil war soon erupted. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, taking refuge in nearby Syria. But she did not retreat in defeat. Instead, she assembled an army of mercenaries and began preparing to take her throne back by force. Fate, however, had other plans, and they arrived in the form of a Roman general whose name would be etched into eternity, Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great. During the Roman Civil War, Pompey had fled to Egypt seeking asylum but was brutally murdered on the orders of Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who hoped to gain favor with Caesar. Instead, Caesar was horrified by the execution of a Roman consul and decided to stay in Alexandria to mediate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. This was Cleopatra's moment. The encounter with Julius Caesar, strategy wrapped in silk. Legend tells us that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's private chambers rolled inside a rug, or, as Plutarch describes, a bed sack, presented as a gift. When the bundle was unrolled, Cleopatra emerged, not only beautiful but dazzlingly confident, charming, and politically astute. Caesar, nearly 52 years old at the time, was captivated. Cleopatra had charisma, but more importantly, she had purpose. She didn't come merely to seduce, she came to forge an alliance. She knew Caesar could restore her to the throne, and Caesar saw in her a potential partner in stabilizing a key region of Rome's eastern sphere. The two struck a bargain. Caesar would support Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and in return, she would maintain Egypt's independence under Roman protection. The war was brief but fierce. Caesar's forces clashed with those loyal to Ptolemy XIII in Alexandria. After months of street fighting, Caesar won. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Cleopatra was reinstated as queen, this time with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as her nominal co-ruler and husband. Though real power now belonged to her alone, Cleopatra remained in Egypt but had become deeply entwined in Roman affairs. She gave birth to a son in 47 BCE, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged the boy, Cleopatra named him Little Caesar and publicly declared him the rightful heir. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra sailed to Rome, staying in Caesar's villa across the Tiber River with Caesarion. Her arrival scandalized Roman society. She was a foreign queen, dressed in luxurious silks, wearing jewels, speaking in exotic tongues. She lived as Caesar's consort while he was still legally married. Her presence challenged everything Rome believed about itself. But Cleopatra was undeterred. She understood power and the symbols of power. She attended public events, dined with senators, and mingled with the elite. Some saw her as a threat, others as a marvel, but all eyes were on her. Then, in 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March. With her protector gone, Cleopatra swiftly returned to Egypt. Caesarion would rule with her now, she decided, and she would make sure Egypt remained strong. But the world was changing, and darker tides were coming. Mark Antony, love, war, and the battle for empire. In the years following Julius Caesar's assassination, Rome was plunged into chaos. The Republic was collapsing under the weight of rival ambitions. Three men formed a shaky alliance to govern what remained of Roman order: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; Marcus Lepidus; and Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general and trusted friend. It was Antony who would soon call upon Cleopatra, not as a conqueror, but as an ally. By 41 BCE, Antony controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Preparing for a military campaign against the Parthians and needing resources, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. Her presence was required not just for diplomatic talks, but for tribute, support, and perhaps submission. Cleopatra, ever the master strategist, understood that this was more than politics. It was theater. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a golden barge, its sails billowing with purple silk, its oars dipped in silver. Cleopatra sat beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and graces. Perfumes wafted through the air, music played softly, and crowds lined the banks to catch a glimpse of her entrance. Mark Antony was not a man easily impressed, but even he was caught off guard. Cleopatra captivated him, not just with beauty, but with intelligence, wit, and confidence. The two became lovers, and their affair quickly blossomed into a political and romantic partnership. That winter, Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where they lived in splendor, indulging in games, drinking contests, and philosophical debates. But beneath the luxury lay strategy. Cleopatra provided Antony with ships, soldiers, and wealth. In return, she gained security for her throne, prestige, and a potential protector for Caesarion. Their union would eventually produce 3 children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. While Rome whispered scandal, the queen and the general dreamed of building a new Eastern Empire, one that would rival, or perhaps surpass, that of Rome. But Rome was watching, and Rome was not amused. The rising storm, Rome turns against Cleopatra. While Antony lived and loved in Alexandria, his enemies in Rome plotted. Chief among them was Octavian, young, calculating, and determined to consolidate power. At first, Antony tried to keep the peace. He married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in a political gesture to unite their factions. But the marriage was hollow. His heart, and his future, remained in Egypt with Cleopatra. As tensions between Antony and Octavian escalated, Octavian launched a brilliant propaganda campaign. He portrayed Antony as a traitor to Rome, ensnared by a foreign temptress, corrupted by Eastern luxury, and planning to crown Caesarion as the true heir of Julius Caesar. Bypassing Octavian altogether, Octavian claimed that Antony had promised vast territories to Cleopatra and their children. He accused Antony of abandoning Rome, betraying his wife, and falling under the spell of an ambitious queen who wanted to bring down the Republic. The Roman people, wary of monarchy and already suspicious of Cleopatra, turned against Antony. The final break came in 32 BCE, when Antony divorced Octavia and openly declared Caesarion as Caesar's rightful son. War was inevitable. Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. This was no longer just a Roman civil war, it was a clash between civilizations. Between East and West. Between a Roman Republic and a Hellenistic kingdom ruled by a queen. The decisive confrontation would come the following year, off the coast of Greece, in the waters of Actium. The Battle of Actium and Cleopatra's fall. The final chapter of Cleopatra's reign was written on the waves of the Ionian Sea. On September 2, 31 BCE, the combined naval forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony clashed with Octavian's fleet near the coast of Actium, in what would become one of the most decisive sea battles in ancient history. Cleopatra and Antony commanded a larger fleet with more heavily armed ships. Yet Octavian held a critical advantage: unity, discipline, and the brilliant leadership of his admiral, Marcus Agrippa. The battle turned into chaos. Cleopatra, realizing the tide had turned, or perhaps acting on a prearranged plan, suddenly broke away from the fight and sailed east with her squadron. Seeing her leave, Antony made a fateful decision. He abandoned the battlefield and followed her, leaving his fleet in disarray. It was a moment of personal loyalty, but strategic ruin. Without its leaders, Antony's navy crumbled. Octavian claimed a resounding victory, one that not only broke Antony's military power but also shattered his reputation in Rome. The lovers fled to Alexandria, now weakened, isolated, and awaiting the inevitable. Octavian followed. By the summer of 30 BCE, his legions marched into Egypt. Facing defeat, Antony fell on his sword after falsely hearing Cleopatra had taken her own life. Gravely wounded, he was brought to her and died in her arms, a final, tragic union between two doomed figures of history. Cleopatra, now truly alone, attempted to negotiate with Octavian. She sought to preserve her children's futures and her kingdom's dignity. But Octavian had no intention of letting her remain a queen. He planned to take her to Rome as a trophy, paraded in chains through the streets as part of his triumph. Cleopatra refused. On August 12, 30 BCE, dressed in royal robes and surrounded by loyal servants, Cleopatra ended her life. According to legend, she used the bite of an asp, a symbol of divine royalty, to carry out her final act. Others suggest poison hidden in a hairpin. However she did it, the result was clear: Cleopatra would not be Rome's captive. With her death, over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to an end.